We've been working hard to make sure that people know who our candidates are, why they're running, and what they're going to do for us down here in southeastern Massachusetts. And so we've been working hard to bring those candidates to you so that you can ask your questions, hear from them directly. Setti has been working hard to get all over the state, and we're happy that he's made it here.
How's everyone doing? It's great to be with you. I do want to tell you why I made the decision to run for governor, but I want to say something about organized labor for a minute. Organized labor has been under assault for decades. We are at a critical moment in our country in and around the ability for people to organize on the ground, whether you're a municipal union or whether you're a part of the trades, whether you're a part of the service union. We have some huge Supreme Court decisions coming down and laws, and unfortunately, we have a governor that says one thing and does another around organized labor. This governor, Charlie Baker, has been a proponent of privatization across the state. This governor has been a proponent of not making investments to give people a leg up, and we're going to get into that. We need to have a chief executive that believes in unions. I got into this race because of economic inequality. At the end of the day, unions actually give people a shot to live a middle-class life, right, in our country. We should be supporting them. And I've been a supporter since I've been mayor with my municipal unions, and I've certainly been a supporter with the contracting and buildings that we build, and I've been a supporter with unions that reside outside of my city, and I'm going to continue to be if you elect me your governor. I want to tell you why I made the decision to run, and it's personal. There are three things in my background that drove me into this race. My 9 years in the military, I enlisted in the military a little bit after 9/11 because America was under attack, and I'm a third-generation combat vet. My dad was in the military, Korean War vet, and my grandfather was a World War II vet. My 8 years as mayor of the city of Newton, working for the 88,000 people in my hometown every single day. And the third is my family. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, 2 children, 9 and 6, and I know where I came from. About 10 years ago, this fall, I got a call from my commanding officer in the Navy Reserves, and he said, "You're going to Iraq for a year, 1 year deployment." Around that same time, my wife Tassie informed me she was pregnant with our first child. So what they do with these deployments, they give you 2 weeks of R&R, you get to come home in the middle of your deployment, and then you have to go back. The first day I got home from my R&R, my daughter was born. So I spent 2 weeks with my newborn baby daughter, Abigail, and my wife Tassie, and then I had to go back to finish my tour of duty. It was one of the toughest things I had to do. 2 things I took from that deployment that has stayed with me. First, an appreciation of the men and women that do multiple deployments. I had only done one, some of whom come back injured, some of whom don't come home at all. The second was being on that base, living with, working with people in certain circumstances that had nothing in common with me. People of different races, religions, backgrounds, political persuasions. We couldn't afford not to work together to get through that year. That stuck with me. In the fall of 2008, I came home to raise my family, made another decision, and that was to run for mayor of my hometown, Newton, Massachusetts. At the time, Newton faced a $40 million projected structural deficit, no rainy day or reserve fund, 2 of the worst conditioned school buildings in the state of Massachusetts, 1 AAA bond rating that was in danger of being downgraded. So a lot of smart political people told me, don't run, you can't win. I had never been in political office before. I had worked for the Clinton administration for 4 years. I ran FEMA, appointed by President Clinton for New England, and I worked for Senator Kerry for 5 years, but I had never run for political office. Me and my campaign knocked on 11,000 doors, and we won that election by 469 votes. In the 8 years since I've been mayor, we've eliminated the $40 million structural deficit. We've grown a rainy day fund that didn't exist to $22 million. We're building 5 new schools in the next 6 years, built with union labor, by the way, 5 new schools in the next 6 years, 3 of which are done. The 4th is being constructed now. We have 2 AAA bond ratings in the city of Newton. We're rebuilding our roads, sidewalks, fire stations, and reinstating public safety officials that we lost before I became mayor. I point to 2 reasons as to how we got there. First, every single one of my budgets were based on outcomes for people, the people of Newton. We found savings in areas that didn't hurt the residents of my community, but enhance them. One of the places was through solar and reduction of energy consumption. We have cut our carbon footprint in half as a municipality in the 8 years since I've been mayor, and we're going to save $40 million over the next 20 years because of the work we did on promoting solar and reducing energy consumption. The second is I wasn't afraid to raise revenue at the city level. When I look at these state budgets coming out of Beacon Hill, same principles must apply. Every single one of these budgets need to be based on outcomes for people, the people of the Commonwealth. We need to find savings that don't hurt people, but actually enhance the Commonwealth. And we can't be afraid to raise revenue at the state level. Last November, I made another decision, and that was not to run for mayor of a third term of my city of Newton. I've loved being the mayor. We've turned Newton around. But as I started to move around the Commonwealth, it became very clear that people and communities are falling behind. I believe the defining issue of our time is economic inequality. And when I think about this issue of economic inequality, I think about my own family. Neither one of my parents grew up with wealth. Both are from New York. My dad grew up in Harlem. My mom grew up in the Bronx. My dad grew up in a neighborhood in Harlem that was deemed the worst block in America by CBS News at the time because of the drugs, gangs, and violence. He got out of that life by joining the military. Went to Korea, came home, met my mom. They went down south to college. Took him 6 years to finish school at North Carolina A&T. Sat at lunch counters and movie theaters to desegregate the South. And my dad found Newton, Mass. Because he was looking for higher ed. And he purchased the home where I grew up with my two sisters and where I live today with my wife and two children, 9 and 6, with GI Bill benefits. GI Bill benefits. This is a government-sponsored program, an investment for people of modest means so they can make ends meet and ensure their kids can do better than they did. That is not happening in the Commonwealth today, and it is wrong. It's bad economics, very bad for the economy, but there is a moral question attached to it. And here's what I'm asking everyone in every city and town I go to ask themselves, and that is this: what kind of Commonwealth do we want to be? What kind of Commonwealth do we want to be? Are we okay with a booming economy happening in and around the greater Boston area, relatively low unemployment rate, but yet at the same time, people are making choices between paying for a copay and going to the doctor or paying for the rent or mortgage? People are making choices between paying for prescription drugs they need for themselves or their family members or putting food on the table. People are being crushed by student debt, can't afford to attain the credential they need or degree to make ends meet in this economy. I don't believe this is okay. I believe this is wrong. I believe we can do better. That's why I put forth 2 proposals when I announced for governor, among many, back in May, one of which is putting in place a single-payer healthcare system in our state now so that people can access affordable healthcare. The second proposal I put forth, among many, was free public college, lifelong, with paid apprenticeships and internships included, so that people can attain the degree they need to make ends meet in this economy. We can't even get to my proposals unless we deal with what is going on with these budgets on Beacon Hill. Just several months ago, just this past year, Standard & Poor's, third-party rating agency, downgraded the bond rating of the state of Massachusetts for the first time in 30 years. And they cited in their report, this isn't me talking, this is the report, the games and gimmicks being played by this Governor Charlie Baker to keep these budgets afloat. There are real consequences to the games and gimmicks Charlie Baker's playing. Just this past year, to close a $500 million deficit, Charlie Baker cut transportation funding, Charlie Baker cut education funding, Charlie Baker cut housing funding, Charlie Baker cut opioid addiction treatment funding in this last year's budget. And to close an $800 million deficit in the coming year, Charlie Baker proposed removing 140,000 people off of Mass Health, our Medicaid system, so it'd be more expensive for people to pay for health care, some of the most vulnerable in our state. This is wrong. It is backwards. We need to look at every single dollar coming out of that state budget. They need to be based on outcomes for people, the people of the Commonwealth. We need to find savings in places that don't hurt people, but closing tax exemptions that give away billions of dollars of special interest. And we can't be afraid to raise revenue at the state level. This is why I believe in the Fair Share Tax Amendment, better known as the millionaire's tax. It's asking people making $1 million a year or more to pay more in revenue and taxes so we can reinvest that in education, in transportation, in places just like New Bedford. These are generational investments that will level the playing field for average everyday people in the Commonwealth, just like the GI Bill did for thousands of families like my own. Before I end, I want to talk about Donald Trump for a few minutes, just for a few minutes. This is important. I know, and I think you all know, I hope you do, we need to push back against any policy, anything that comes out of Donald Trump's White House that hurts people, goes against our values. The proposal to remove 32 million people off of health care is wrong. We've got to stand up and say no. The Muslim ban is wrong. The proposal to ban transgender people from the military is wrong. The proposal to federalize police officers, make them into ICE agents, is wrong. We got to push back and say no, this doesn't make us more safe, it makes us less safe. Anything that is bigoted, that is racist, that is xenophobic, sexist, we got to say no, never normalize it. At the same time, there are people that voted for Donald Trump that did not vote for him for these reasons. There are 7,000 people that voted for Donald Trump in my hometown, Newton, Massachusetts. I know many of them. Used to see them at City Hall every single day when I was working there. Some of them are parents of kids that my kids play with in the city of Newton. Donald Trump won 93 communities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He got more votes than Charlie Baker did. We have got to reach out to those people if we're going to address economic inequality, and most importantly, if we're going to leave a world better off for my kids and your kids and our grandkids. We have got to be one Commonwealth. We've got to work together. And that's what I learned on that base in Iraq. We couldn't afford not to work with people that didn't think like us, look like us, came from different parts of the country. We had to work together. I believe the same applies to the state of Massachusetts right now. So look, this is going to be a tough campaign. It's going to be won by good old-fashioned grassroots politics, getting people turned out, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, not just saying what we're against, but what we are for. If we do this, we will not only change the governor next year, but we will change governance so our Commonwealth lives up to its full potential. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me. Thank you. Lisa, can I take questions? Take a few questions.
Dana?
I have a question. So,
Sure.
We have a sheriff of Bristol County who's dead set on turning his agency into another ICE. They have I think, one of the highest rates of suicides in there, not really offering services, high recidivism. What can you do about this man so that our jails are a place where people actually get reformed and not abused?
Well, one of the first things we got to do, Counselor, is we got to make sure we pass the Safe Communities Act on Beacon Hill. Newton put a Safe Communities welcoming ordinance in place, and other cities have those in place, and we need to do it on Beacon Hill at the state level. And we should also reverse what Charlie Baker did with the state police, because Deval Patrick actually did not have our state police acting as ICE agents. By the way, there are real choices in this election, ladies and gentlemen. Real choices. Charlie Baker, back in June, Supreme Judicial Court decision came down and said it was legal for cities like Newton to have Safe Communities acts in place, right? So that our police officer wouldn't be federalized. And by the way, do we really want undocumented people afraid to talk to the police if they're victims of crime, right? Or if they witness a crime? Police officers don't want that. But back in June, Supreme Judicial Court affirmed communities like Newton do that, right? Charlie Baker submits a deportation bill. About a month later, that would negate the Lund decision and allow for Jeff Sessions and Trump to federalize police officers. So folks, there's a real choice in this election. I mean, you know, we've got to make sure we get the facts out there. So I believe that is a first step, and it needs to be done. If I were governor, I'd be engaging mayors, town managers, select persons, counselors, all across the state around getting this legislation passed.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm a registered nurse, and you just made a statement about the opioid and how Charlie Baker is cutting back on that.
Yep.
Where he talks quite a bit about it. You know, in a nuts and bolts world, how would you create an opioid budget that then would be exempt from cuts? Maybe be flatlined, but would be exempt from cuts every time a whim comes, not a whim, mind you, every time some sort of crunch comes along. How would you protect something like that? Because this is the beat we get. The beat we get is that, oh yeah, well, we got to cut somewhere. Be responsible, so they cut. How much did he cut? What was the number you said?
So look,
What did
here's
he
the
cut
deal.
and how much did he cut?
Here's the deal. Here's the deal. He cut opioid addiction funding for Barnstable County. But let me just, for a quick minute, let me tell you why that's happening for a minute. Why are we saying that we have to shuffle money around and we don't have enough money? There's a reason for it. We have a structural deficit at the state level. I just want to talk about that. I don't know if people understand that at this moment, we are not taking in enough revenue to pay for what we're doing right now. From my perspective, what the governor needs to do is provide something called a level service maintenance budget right now. All that means is give us the amount of money it takes to pay for what we're paying for right now as far as state services right now. I asked the governor to do this last year. I asked the Speaker and the Senate President. I sent a letter. I also asked the governor and the Senate President and Speaker to not just provide a level service budget, but it starts with the governor, but do 5-year revenue projections, right? They only do one right now at the state level. We're required by state law to balance the state budget. What's been happening under the Baker administration, there have been some revenue projections that have been a little rosy coming out of Beacon Hill. And they put that revenue projection in place. They don't provide you with the transparency around a level service maintenance budget. Halfway through the year, governor has the power to make cuts because he has to make sure the budget's balanced. So that's where those cuts came from. So this is what goes on, and this is what's been happening. Baker does not want to provide a level service maintenance budget for a very simple reason. He knows what I know, exactly what I just told you. We're not taking in enough money to pay for what we're doing right now. So at the end of the day, what would I do around this? The first thing I would do is provide my first House 1 budget in 2019 would be a level service maintenance budget, put it out there so everyone sees the gap. The second thing we have to acknowledge is that we have to raise revenue. We've got to raise revenue. It's not just about finding savings. It's not just about closing tax exemptions, as I said, but we have to raise revenue. I believe, and that's why I believe in the Fair Share Tax Amendment. Back to your question about opioids. I don't want to talk about opioids. And just, sure, I'm happy to. At the end of the day, after all said and done, we have to recognize this as a crisis, and we have to recognize the fact that we're going to have to ask people to pay a little bit more money to deal with it. In 2014, Governor Patrick declared a state of emergency around opioid addiction. We were the first state to do it. Since then, 6,000 people have died of opioid addiction. 5 people are dying a day here in the state of Massachusetts of opioid addiction. 250,000 people are living with opioid addiction in the state of Massachusetts. That number is growing. The governor and the legislature passed some legislation to provide additional Narcan. I appreciate the fact that they did that. I also appreciate the fact that they have attempted to ratchet back the ability for people to prescribe prescription drugs. But with those numbers, we're not doing enough. We need to do treatment. We need to do education and prevention. But we're not doing what needs to be done as far as making sure people have not just detox beds, but lifelong treatment that's community-based. So what would I do? Right now,
I'm talking about the budget.
I know, I'm talking about the budget too. What would I do? Right now, I started a series of conversations about opioid addiction because I want to shine a light on what is happening on the ground in our communities all over the state. I've gone all over the state. I've been to different communities. I'm going to be here on the 27th to do a roundtable about it. The reason for it is, number one, we've got to destigmatize it because there's a big stigma attached to it. Number two, we need to get new thinking and ideas about how to treat people. And number three, we have to shine a light on the fact that we need to invest more money. So I believe that at this moment, we have to look at every revenue option, which we're not doing, that is not regressive on the tax side. We need to match that with the treatment that is needed on the ground. This is not happening at the state level. We have a governor right now that is an ideologue around revenue. He continues to say no new broad-based revenue. I believe we need to raise it, and I think we need to make sure we're accountable for every single dollar. So from my perspective, we are not putting in place the best thinking and ideas across the state around addiction, around treatment, and we are not having a real true conversation about raising revenue to treat people. That is what I believe.
I got you, but my question was,
Yep.
if you set a budget, I'm just gonna throw a number, say the number is
Yep.
$50 million.
Yep.
How do you put in place that it can't go below $50 million?
You create something called outcome-based budgeting.
That's my question.
Right? So what I did in Newton, I cleaned up a huge deficit. Right now, your budget's not based on outcomes. Your budget's based on a spreadsheet and the governor moving money around and put those gimmick tricks in place. We need to create specific outcomes, put them out, right? Make sure we're accountable around not just opioid addiction, around education, around transportation. You need to know what they are, and we need to drive towards those. They need to be out. This is what I would do if I were governor. And we need to drive, and we have to be honest about what it's going to take and what the cost is going to be. That's it.
Fair answer.
Yes.
You will be hopefully running against Charlie Baker. But Massachusetts has a history of electing Republican governors. To put it bluntly, perhaps because there is a majority of people in the state who don't trust the legislature. Your experience in Massachusetts, though you've worked in the federal legislative arena, doesn't include being in the legislature. Neither did Deval Patrick's. Deval proposed revenue increase in his last year as governor, and it went nowhere in the legislature. You talk about safe cities. Actually, Charlie Baker yesterday responding to the ending of protected status for Salvadorans also mentioned the need to pass safe cities. It's sitting in the legislature. It hasn't been passed. Our representative is one of the primary sponsors of it, and it affects this community. So how would you work with the legislature to get what you...
Ben, do you know, Charlie Baker is not for the Safe Communities Act.
He put out a statement, a press release about this big federal decision, but in practice, he is working with the federal government. He is very much against the Safe Communities Act.
I just want to, no, but that's an important fact. I just want to make sure that that's corrected. But go ahead.
The point is, the legislature hasn't gotten its job done, and it hasn't gotten its job done in certain other areas, like transportation, like getting us the rail, and education, and housing, and opioid addiction, and other things. So, Newton had a strong mayor system. You had a city council, presumably. How do you get this done? How do you see yourself working with a legislature that isn't always serving the interests that you speak so eloquently about?
So I believe very strongly in taking some of the good practices and governance that I put in place in Newton and taking them to the governor's office. What do I mean by that? I had to do some pretty tough things as mayor and change the way some policies. I had to raise taxes, which Newton doesn't usually do, and they had only done it one time. I did 70 town halls in my first term, just bringing people into City Hall, into the process with the facts. I ran on an agenda to fix the school buildings, to get more teachers, the roads, the fire stations, very ambitious agenda. I knew that, not all the city councilors were all that involved with that, and they didn't think it could happen. The only way I was going to get it done was making sure that the people I work for were armed with the information and held me accountable as well as the city councilors accountable. I'm going to do the same thing if I'm governor. I mean, that's the only way I know how to govern, is be connected to the people I work for. I'd be back out on the road. I would make sure that you're armed with all the information that you have. I'm running on a quite ambitious agenda. And I'm going to ask you to hold me accountable as well as the legislature. So I'm not going to be a creature of Beacon Hill, just like I wasn't a creature of City Hall. That's how we're going to get this done. That's the only way we're going to get this done. By the way, just so you know, I know Charlie Baker knows he's going to be beaten next year because he's got his Republican tracker, Pat, right back there, who's, give him a round of applause. He follows me everywhere. Pat the Tracker from the Republican State Committee. This is how I know. Charlie Baker's worried. This is how I know we're going to win. What other questions?
Do you have a plan for how you will change over from the present healthcare system we have to a single payer? Great
question. So, why do I believe this is important? Just for a quick minute. Again, this election is about choices. At this moment, we have a healthcare system that is crushing people and crushing businesses and crushing municipalities because the cost is going up. The answer out of Washington is to make it more expensive for people, particularly vulnerable people, to afford health care, or average people, or remove them completely. The same can be said for Charlie Baker. I mentioned he was going to remove he tried to remove 140,000 people off of Mass Health. Legislature stopped him. If we continue careening down this road, we're going to continue to have catastrophic scenarios for individuals and families and communities. It is unacceptable. Now, there are some good things about healthcare in the state of Massachusetts that we want to retain. 98% of folks have some sort of insurance. That's really good. Romney and Kennedy got together, modeled healthcare, universal health back in the middle part of the decade. That's a good thing. Good doctors, some good healthcare providers, right? That's good too. We want to retain those things. The challenge here is we are the second highest, most expensive state as far as healthcare in the entire country. That number continues to go up. So I believe when I talk about single payer, I have 4 principles that I use as sort of the guiding principles. And I want to talk about where I would reduce costs. My 4 principles are, number 1, we need a system that's based on the health outcomes for people in our state. Second, it's got to be accessible no matter where you live. Third, it's got to be affordable. Fourth, we need to make sure people have the right kind of coverage. Because just because you have insurance doesn't mean that you have the right kind of coverage to keep you healthy at this moment. If we put these principles in place, we should be reducing costs not by burdening people, but through reducing administrative costs and prescription drug costs. These are the areas where we need to be going to unburden the system. I understand very clearly this is very complicated. It is not a scenario where you can put a key in it and turn it and all of a sudden, there's a lot of different providers out there. It's a disparate system. But we have got to drive towards these principles now. I'm hearing from people everywhere across the state, including this city and other cities, that their health is failing and otherwise because they can't afford health care. They don't have the access, limited number of visits, too expensive. This is where we are. So I have an urgency about this. When I talk about economic inequality, this is a driver. It's a primary driver of it in Massachusetts. We've got to deal with it. We've got to deal with it. So that's how I see it. Yes.
We're talking about emphasis on economic inequality, but we also have regional economic inequality.
Yep, I agree.
And what way would you address the issues of high electricity rates, which affect manufacturing, transportation, access to jobs in different regions of the state?
Yes. So there are 4 areas I've really focused on in and around dealing with economic inequality. You hit 2 of them at the same time. There is no doubt inequity in different regions in the state. And part of that is not just state spending, but there are certain communities that have stronger tax bases than others, where they can do some of the things that in Greater Boston area that you can't do, say for instance, New Bedford. So on transportation, the driver of economic inequality. I mean, I think we were talking a little earlier. How many decades have people talked about South Coast Rail? I mean, I don't, decades about South Coast Rail. Why? I mean, it goes back to what you and I were talking about. For 2 decades, there's just thinking around up in that State House that you can do something for nothing. I mean, I hate to put it in those stark terms, but somehow people applaud. Charlie Baker did a tax cut when he was A&F secretary. He was really proud of that tax cut in 1998. 2002, another tax cut, right? I mean, we need to invest in South Coast Rail. We need to invest in strong transit, regional transit authorities that get to people where they need to go off of rail. I also believe in East-West Rail, North-South Rail Link, Blue Line extension. We have to invest in upgrading our transportation system. It is inadequate and under-resourced. It's the fact. The other places that are not equitable in our state is around education. We know right now we have a Chapter 70 formula that is outdated, 1993, that funds schools in our state, and we're not providing the resources we need to educate every child in every district. And that's wrong too. We got to redo that formula and make investments. That's why I was against question 2. It's the most cynical questions I've seen in a long time. That Charlie Baker spent millions of dollars on, I think, Secretary, right? Something like that. Went on TV, question 2, dark money or whatever, right? Spent all this money, and guess what? We went out there, I was against question 2. We went door to door, grassroots, and we beat him with all of his money. We're going to do the same thing next year. So we need to, you're right, there is regional inequity. There are whole communities. I mean, we were talking a little earlier about the last shirt manufacturing factory, right? Fran, it was 31st, closed down. I mean, why is it that this governor is slowing down offshore wind? Slowing it down. He's talking 10 years, maybe 2027. We got to do it now. We got to invest in that now so that we can not just have cleaner energy, but create jobs right here in New Bedford. We got to do this now. So yes, there is regional inequity. There's not parity clearly in regions across the state. I haven't gone to the different regions, but it's going to take investment. You're right. And honesty about the budget, which is what we were talking about. Yes.
I see lots of places you've mentioned for investment. How much of this can be achieved via the millionaire's tax? And what is the issue, or what is the resistance to increasing progressive taxation throughout the state?
So look, we've been talking about, I've been alluding to this. The truth of the matter is, close your ears if you're a Ronald Reagan fan. In 1980, Ronald Reagan sold everyone a bill of goods. Pretty simple. If we just give big tax breaks to wealthy people, it's going to rain down and voodoo economics, or whatever George Bush called it. I'm serious. If we just get government out of the way and lower taxes, somehow the rugged individual will succeed and everyone will be good. This thinking has been pervasive in Washington, but it's also been pervasive in state houses across the country, including Massachusetts, for a couple of decades. So we've got to start to tell the truth about making sure that we are making these investments and asking people that are doing really well, particularly in and around Greater Boston area, to contribute so that we can invest in education and transportation and have a progressive tax system, not a regressive one. And it's not just about beating people up because they're doing well. That's not what I'm talking about. It's about making sure the Commonwealth is making a generational investment so that this economy continues to grow for everyone, not just for a few people or a few different industries or a few different cities. So part of this campaign for me is a generational call to everyone. We got to wake up. We got to tell the truth. Yes, we have to ask folks to contribute more. We're doing really well. Yes, we have to be responsible with that money and accountable with outcomes and driving towards those at the same time. That's good governance. That's the way I see it.
Just one question. Talk about progressive taxation. The issue of regressive taxation, such as the property tax.
Yeah.
And how do we address it with, say, the millionaire's tax is passed? Will some of that revenue be used to offset regressive taxation, such as the property tax? Because you're talking about bringing back some of the people who, say, voted for Trump. When local communities I know of who are good Democrats vote other than Democrat because of the property taxation. And it's something that we should address as well as we're talking about progressive taxation and how we have to fill in all the gaps in state funding.
So just so everyone's clear, that fair share tax amendment is earmarked for education and transportation. And so that's what that money is earmarked for. However, the truth of the matter is, Baker's up there. Baker announced re-election back in December. And there were three things he highlighted as success stories for his administration. One of which was transportation. You're supposed to laugh at that. The second, I mean, come on. The second, in a more serious note, was the opioid addiction, addressing opioid addiction. That was the second thing he said. And the third thing he said was holding the line on no new taxes. So this is this thinking I've been said. Unfortunately, he can say he's not raising people's taxes himself, but the fact is that property taxes continue to go up. The pressure's on cities and towns to pay for all the services that they're cutting at the state level. So it comes right back to you. And now you have these cities and towns that are levying up to 2% because they have to.
We have to send that message.
Yes. Exactly. So you're not getting a tax cut. When Charlie Baker says he's holding the line on taxes, he's no new taxes, he's not giving you a tax break. He's giving you broken down transportation, continuing that. He's giving you cuts in education and teachers. He's telling you he's not going to address the opioid addiction for real, crisis for real. And you're paying higher property taxes. That's where we're at. That is where we're at. And it's wrong. That's why we got to tell the truth. I want to earn your support in this race. Two things I just want to share a quick story with you. It'll be really fast. I want to share with you. I think that's emblematic for me around this election. I was up at UMass Lowell a few months ago. I was in a classroom, had a session like this with students. And it was a really great session. A young man stood up and he said, I think I'm going to support you, but I have one question. He said, what is the biggest issue for you in this campaign? So I had to think for a second. And it wasn't a policy issue. I didn't think about policy. I said it was two things. Number one, the acceptance of the status quo. The acceptance of the status quo. And the second was you can't do anything about it. I believe we cannot accept Charlie Baker's status quo. Charlie Baker's status quo around not addressing opioids. Charlie Baker's status quo around transportation and getting people to where they need to go. Charlie Baker's status quo on educating our children in our state. Charlie Baker's status quo on healthcare and the costs that are crushing people. We should not and cannot accept Charlie Baker's low expectations and status quo anymore in this state, and we can do something about it. And that's what this campaign is about for me and for you and our Commonwealth. So I ask you to join our effort over the next year. Thank you very much. I want to earn your support. Appreciate you having me. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.